Ah, the smiling faces of your neighbors, the wonderful peasants who gather in the village tavern at night, or who practice all kinds of merriment on the green. But behind those smiles, there are some interesting secrets, and in the outskirts of cities, and under the shade of lone trees, in cottages, and in those very same huts and cabins, a different type of magic brews. Today on Desks and Dorks, we're talking about peasant magic and folk magic. Hello, my name is Kyle. You're watching Desks and Dorks. I am the dork. Couple things. The YouTube pleasantries would go a long way to helping us. The best way to help myself and the rest of the team over at Desks and Dorks, however, is backing or sharing our Kickstarter for A Fear Within. It's our rules light horror RPG that is Pokemon by way of Stephen King, where you will play with partners, one of you taking on the roles of a child, the other one taking on the role of the very real monster with powers that lives inside of them. As of recording, we have 11 days left to go. We are fully and completely funded on Kickstarter, but we are working our way to some amazing stretch goals, including extra art and bonus characters for the game. Would really mean a lot to me if you would share or back. By the light of the loon, it's editing Kyle with a magic incantation, interjecting myself into the middle of my own video. We got to the end, and I didn't tell you what folk magic is, or what I consider folk magic to be, and that is simply magical practices used by individuals to help achieve their goals, usually financial, social, or political, or to help tear down their enemies. And now, while any member of the social strata is capable of performing folk magic, as it would have been something that has slowly gained precedence through folk practice, tradition, both religious and secular, and other things, I am always more concerned with how it was used by the lower classes, particularly the peasantry. This art, by the way, is done by the amazing Smoke Cellar. They're a member of the Desks and Dorks Discord, and they actually did some of the art for the Bandit video, and I used it without even knowing who it belonged to. They reached out and said they loved the content and they wanted to make something for this video specifically, and Smoke Cellar made this phenomenal peasant mage, and I absolutely love it. I love the use of the peasant robes that have been sort of turned into mage's robes, the use of a shepherd's staff as a magic staff, and the pitchfork as a conduit for lightning. I think Smoke Cellar did a fantastic job of capturing the vibe of a peasant mage, and I really love it. Hopefully we will have links in the description for their art down below, and if I don't have it for this video, I will most likely edit it, so it will be up at some point in the description as long as they give me the stuff. They haven't sent me their links yet. So again, thank you to Smoke Cellar for this wonderful interpretation of folk magic. I will most likely be using this moving forward for a couple different things, so thank you again, Smoke Cellar, for this. Back to the video, if you can. Now, let's talk about a couple things. One, what will we review when I talk about magic in this context, or folk magic, which is a term I'm going to use quite often. I am talking less about wizards and more about how magic would have been used and practiced by the peasantry, and how it would have been used by the common man, or the common layfolk. We're going to be talking about how magic was viewed and practiced among medieval cultures, how to implement it into our RPGs, so I'm going to give you some game rules, some bonus content there at the end. Two very important things that are going to be different, however. One, usually I save the Q&As for the end, but I wanted to experiment a little with the form, and so those of you who either on the Discord, which you can get in the description below, or on the community post, so when you check the community tab for Desks and Dorks, if you asked questions in the Q&A, we will have a Q&A at the end, but I've actually interspersed some of my favorite Q&A questions throughout the video because I thought that would be kind of neat and would maybe work as like a little Easter egg for those of you who are engaged in the community, which I thought was kind of cool. Two, my training was as a Western medievalist, which means I focused on Western Europe pretty specifically. This means I will be leaving out vast swaths of the world during the medieval time period. Those countries, those time periods, those cultures are worth engaging with. However, I feel like I do not have the training and ability to portray those times and histories with the nuance that they are deserving of. So, let's talk about this now. Now, why the contentious thumbnail? And I'm going to tell you right why. Because when I talk about peasant folk magic, it tends to be a couple different things that make me like it more than something like Merlin in his tower or Elminster flying through the realms in D&D. It generally tends to be more granular. Folk magic is generally tied to the traditions, the working practices of the working class, which for me makes it a much more thematic and richly detailed concept of magic. Two, it tends to hurt as much as help. If you've ever read the Grimm Brothers fairy tales, you will know that magic is a sword that cuts both ways, and oftentimes cuts its wielder as deep, if not deeper, than its intended targets. And finally, it has very specific uses, which, by putting constraints on this vast power, tends to lend itself to creative problem solving. That's why I really love peasant and folk magic. With that out of the way, let's talk about this. Now, folk magic tradition, it tends to be a combination of established religious practices and traditions, along with elements of pagan worship and folk tradition. So again, we're talking about the historical perspective on folk magic, and I really want to bring this up right now because it is the biggest and, in my research, the most common way that magic was presented. It's not just as if they created a whole new tradition verbally or in their literature. They really just sort of combined a lot of things that were already existent with real religious practices of the time. Now remember, when we're looking at the Middle Ages and Europe during the Middle Ages, this is primarily with Catholicism. I'm going to recommend a wonderful video by an artist called Horses over here on YouTube who talks about the practices of pagan witchcraft in Iceland. I found their video and the research that they included in it to be invaluable in my own work in this regard. And one of the things that they brought up most of the time is that this took place as a pure fusion. It was particularly common in Iceland, for example, to have priests that would have practiced, in some cases, witch-like rituals, or would have been aware of parish members who were conducting Witchuals. I'm going to call them Witchuals. If they would have been practicing Witchuals, and would have been very aware of this fact. So in many cases, at least in Iceland, and the way that those witches would have worked and functioned alongside practicing Catholics, it was sort of a fusion of both beliefs, with the two actually coexisting in many ways, although this base relief tells you that eventually that did end. This lasted for a tremendously long period of time in Iceland's history, and we're very fortunate that there are multiple manuscripts of the way that Icelandic witch and religious practices were combined and coexisted with one another in this sort of blend of fusion. In this environment, it is entirely common. In fact, and it's actually really interesting that we see both priests and witches coexisting, but we have very detailed results and detailed accounts of trials of witches once Iceland starts to crack down on this practice. And now that we're on the topic of both Catholic religious practices and what would be viewed as folk magic and folk ritual magic being combined, what a perfect time for us to segue into some Q&As. Because something that comes from us, from a good friend of ours called Carl Makes Stuff. Carl is a wonderful podcaster. I had the pleasure of talking to them recently. Carl actually talked about how widespread magic was across social strata. And in fact, I want to bring this particular question up right now because one of the things to take into account was that the priesthood, particularly the Catholic priesthood in the early Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages, was for the most part a member of the upper class. Remember, most Catholic priests or Catholic officials, Catholic religious figures, would have been professionally educated, would have had access to land of some kind, as well as an income provided to them both by the church and by their parishioners in the form of tithe or in the form of donations, which means that for these Catholic priests to be living and working amongst the Icelandic population in the ways that they were, so this kind of magic would have been common across that social strata, as well as the social strata of the regular Icelandic peasant, and among some of the Icelandic business owners. One of the actual accounts that comes up in Horse's video is an account between two landowners who actually would have enjoyed a pretty substantial amount of income. This is widely true as well across most of Europe. Now, obviously, there are economic and social reasons why one might turn to magic, and we're actually going to talk about some of those a little bit later in our video. But it does seem that although our focus today is on the magic of the common folk and the magic of the layperson, the magic of the poor and the struggling, it does seem like magic, for the most part in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, did seem to cross across all social strata pretty much ad nauseum and not necessarily without impunity. It was a really common occurrence and would have been found among pretty much everybody, which is kind of neat. Chris Bates also asks, magic or science? Medicine is seen as magical but has a foundation in biological sciences and leanings. And again, I brought this up because I think it's interesting when we talk about witches in particular. One of the reasons I wanted to bring this up was that most of our myths, or not most of, but many of our myths about magic and the arcane about sorcery often originate from a lack of or an improper understanding of scientific thoughts and processes. One of the reasons I wanted to bring this particular question up at this point during the presentation is that witches' cauldrons actually come from a medieval misunderstanding of how biological cultures would have worked. You see, over time, tubs, which would have been used for brewing, this, by the way, was not just true in medieval Europe, but we have evidence of this occurring in ancient Egypt in some of the earliest breweries. But essentially what would happen is that brewers would have cauldrons that they would have passed down, or large tubs that they would have passed down to brew their meads, their beers, their alcohol, essentially, and over time those receptacles would have cracks. Over time, the yeast colonies from certain batches would form permanent colonies, in many cases, in the crevices of these tubs, and those permanent colonies would essentially reinfuse into the mixture every single time that it was actually being brewed, allowing those batches brewed in those quote-unquote magic cauldrons to actually last and keep longer and produce both higher quality and better tasting alcohol. So again, it is entirely plausible and possible that many of our understandings of and myths about magic and the arcane from a folk perspective come from, at the time, unexplainable biological and scientific phenomena. Not only is this a common practice in places like Iceland, but we're starting to see characters that reflect this historical reality in games and in game media. Those of you who know me know that I love dark, low fantasy. I love it when a fantasy gets into the nitty-gritty, and I'm particularly a big fan of Berserk. And one of the games that I've been really enjoying is a game called Fear and Hunger, and one of the characters in this prominent RPG is a guy named Enkion, who is a priest of Almir, which is in this world the analogous stand-in for Jesus Christ, but is also, in addition to being a devout follower of this Christ-like figure, a dark wizard. This is a character that combines Catholic elements, major Catholic elements, with elements of pagan witchcraft and magical rituals, and it's really interesting to see how characters like Enkion are starting to see use in modern gaming. But folk magic wasn't just a long-lasting fusion of religious elements and magical rituals. Sometimes people in their daily life just grabbed magical stuff and attempted to use it. This is akin to, if you have ever played Dungeons & Dragons, your character that has absolutely no ability to use magical devices whatsoever, ripping a wand out of a chest, pointing it at the nearest scary thing, saying whatever magical mumbo-jumbo they can come up with, and hoping it works and doesn't kill them in the process of trying to destroy their enemy. This is most common, weirdly enough, in the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, the empire that styled itself as both holy, Roman, and incredibly Catholic, and later incredibly Protestant, is actually one of the places where this phenomenon of folk magic tends to get used the most. One of the biggest traditions in the Holy Roman Empire was treasure hunting. So if you have ever played Tomb Raider and you're like, wow, there aren't enough sickly white men in this game, that's basically what the Holy Roman Empire was for a pretty large chunk of history, where you would have peasants who were desperate for money or a chance at a better life, grabbing whatever sort of magic relics, quote-unquote magic relics, they could find and using them to actually attempt to find treasure. They would use spells and incantations and enchantments on themselves. They would carry with them artifacts for luck and special blessings, and they would use dowsing rod-esque artifacts. Again, I didn't know what else to call them. They weren't actually dowsing rods, although some of them were actually dowsing rods, but artifacts to essentially ascertain the location of buried or lost loot. This is absolutely amazing. And it gets even more amazing when you consider, again, this is a heavily Catholic and, again, eventually heavily Protestant populace, but it's really fun because the court trials and court practices against this were incredibly inconsistent. In the readings that I did, some people did face actual heresy charges and real heavy punishment, cough cough, sometimes death. However, in a lot of cases, these treasure hunters were just kind of given a slap on the wrist, a turn up to the head, and just told to go home. Literally, it almost seems like in some of the cases that I was reading about in the secondary sources, that the judges were just like, it's a Tuesday. What is, Rupert supposed to do? Not grab the skull of the deceased saint and hopefully whisper to it and have it lead him to untold amounts of gold? I mean, again, it's Tuesday. We all do that on a Tuesday. But in addition to all of these different ways, sometimes magical and religious elements simply combined for worship, and nowhere is this more clear than in the saint cults of the Middle Ages. Now, for those of you not in the know, in Catholic faith, it is entirely possible, plausible, and in fact encouraged in some cases to venerate a saint. Now, venerate does not mean worship in the Catholic context. It means that you look to a saint for what we call intercession. You know that a saint is a particularly holy person, somebody who has been graced by God within the Catholic parlance. This means that because they have been so graced, they are most likely able to put in a good word for you, essentially, to the big man upstairs. And in fact, intercession is a cornerstone of Catholic belief. To put it in modern terms, imagine, for example, that you want to get a job and your homie actually works at the place you want to get a job at. So you call him, you text him, you say, hey man, can you put in a good word for me at your place of employment? I know that you've got an in, hook me up. That's essentially what this is. But, you know, instead of being hooked up with gainful employment, you're being hooked up with spiritual grace, blessings, whatever. Now, this does, however, unfortunately get taken to its extreme sometimes, because remember, if you were a low peasant, somebody who is dwelling on the outskirts of medieval civilization, occasionally intercession can, and in some cases did, morph into real, honest-to-God, genuine worship of these saints, something that sort of steps beyond the pale of regular intercession and the regular veneration of those saints. This winds up becoming a huge issue. Now, and it ties into another one of our Q&A questions. This is from Exdith the Unlucky, and I hope I got your name right. Exdith, by the way, wonderful member of the Discord and a scholar in their own right, was going to say, hey, are you going to include the invocation of the 14 holy helpers? And this is a wild ride. So I love that Exdith brought this up, because within medieval history, there are 14 particular saints. These saints were ones who were particularly helpful, usually for warding off disease or ill fortune, and it was believed that the veneration of these saints and their intercession was far more likely and far more common than it was for other saints. And over time, these 14 holy helpers became known as, obviously, the 14 holy helpers, but it was entirely possible and plausible that they, of course, developed some form of saint worship as well. Now, again, when we're talking about folk magic, we're talking about processes that sort of give or extend magical abilities or magical qualities to existing things. And again, saint worship is one of those elements. It's important to consider that in many cases, human history is a continuation of or an evolution of practices that have come before it. And in ancient times, and I'm not even talking about medieval times, but I'm talking about in the era of antiquity, it was entirely plausible and in fact common that individuals would engage in an almost transactional relationship with the gods they worship. Again, if you worship a god, you expect something in return. That sort of transactional relationship is in fact very common throughout most of antiquity, and it sort of seems to continue on in the relationship that some medieval peasants had with these saint cults. The idea was, if I give you faith, I expect to get this power, this blessing, this grace, which is going to help me not just extend my life, but extend the quality of my life, and perhaps even allow me to rise above my social strata, or in some cases, get revenge on my enemies. But now that we established the form of folk magic, let's talk about how it was actually practiced. Now, I'm going to be borrowing heavily from my work already in the low fantasy video. If you watch that one, you're going to watch me tread some familiar ground, but charms and folk talismans were incredibly common. You see, there's a sort of belief or importance of passive magic. Essentially, the idea that elements of magic could be imbued in charms, trinkets, and other objects that would be carried with you for good luck, to ward off bad luck, to protect you from evil, or to grant you some sort of physical, mental, spiritual, or emotional boon. I love this particular one. I've reused this picture from a previous video, but I love it so much because it is essentially a topographical map, not of England and its geographical features, but of the different charms that they have found in archaeological dig sites across the country. But another thing that I love about this one is that these charms illustrate the passive nature of some folk magic. These were carried in order to either A, ward off bad fortune, B, bring good fortune forward, or protect from very specific things, bad weather, a jilted lover, so to speak, a certain type of disease, or perhaps to even bring about a good harvest, luck at the gambling table, any number of very hyper-specific things that would have been focused on the affairs of the common man. They took on many different forms. I particularly love the old playing card that has been sort of altered a little bit to be one of those, but they could look like any number of particular artifacts. This little voodoo bottle, I know it's not particularly a voodoo bottle, but the pins in the cork remind me a little bit of old voodoo dolls, or the cartoon representation of voodoo dolls. The smooth stone would have been carried by a farmhand, actually. That's where they found this particular one. But again, these are charms that would have been carried by individuals. They would have been made from things that were readily available on hand and used for hyper-specific purposes. I love these. They're very interesting, and I think the thing about them that I love the most as a game master is how can I take these and repurpose them into my games. The button, for example, in the top right-hand corner of our screen is a perfect one. This is a bronze or a brass button. I'm not entirely positive which one, but again, this is a really simple thing that someone could find. This could have been taken from, I don't know, the scraps of a tailor shop found on a street, and if you're a peasant with very little money and big ambitions and big dreams, something as simple as this could be your lucky charm, your lucky talisman, as you move forward in your life. You see, again, charms were carried as a form of passive magic, and folk magic in many cases is passive. It's not just grabbing something to help you during an active task, but it's something that you could benefit from just by having it on your person or by making a small ritual with it. And that leads us to rituals and ceremonial casting. Now, when we think of the witch's sabbat, the rites of a dark priest, or if we're thinking about fiction, we might think of the work of H.P. Lovecraft and the cultists of Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, and perhaps even Yog Sothoth. It's really easy for us to picture rituals, and that makes sense. You see, Catholicism in general, as the dominant religion, is very ritual-focused. Even now, in modern Catholic practice, there is a large emphasis on and focus about rituals and the importance of certain ritual rites. The robes of a priest, for example, in Catholic culture, usually coincide to different parts of the liturgical year. For example, as a kid, I was always perplexed that our priest wore green all of the time, not realizing that like 60-70% of our liturgical year is what we literally call ordinary time, which is why they wear those, and other special colors would have been used for religious services or special high holy days and religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, for example. Now, it's very easy to see how in this heavily ritualized religious practice, ritual casting does become real, and in many cases, some of our myths about modern witchcraft and even the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a Catholic witch hunting manual that's available publicly, by the way, it's a very interesting read if you ever want to give it a try, do depict witch-like practices very similarly to Catholic practices as well, or at the very least, religious rituals in general. If you are putting religious rituals in your games, I think one of the best ways to make folk magic feel grounded and connected to the world that you are building is to make inversions of those religious rituals and make those examples of folk magic. This brings us to a couple good Q&As. I figure that because we've talked about rituals and magic rituals in general, it's interesting for us to bring up this question from Dungeon Matron about Druidism and Druid magic in history, and how does it relate to modern Wiccan worship. Now, I'm going to say right now, point blank, that I am not an expert in the Wiccan faith, particularly in modern Wiccanism, but I did grow up having a couple pagan friends. It's pretty easy to see that there are some pagan rituals that do, or at least look like from an outside perspective, somebody who knows of people in the faith but is not practicing Wiccan faith, that those would look like extensions of those rituals. However, I'm just going to say right now, as much as I can say, hey, this makes sense, and from the outside, it does look like these are continuations or extensions of these religious practices, I don't want to say that with any degree of certainty or expertise. I would probably defer to somebody who is either a practicing Wiccan or someone who is a little bit more knowledgeable on that historical fact. Savage Jeff, however, I do love this question, and it's one that I think fits really well, because Savage Jeff wanted to know why gamers went from saying X level class, so like 9th level class of a spell, to a level X spell. And I think this has nothing to do with history and more to do with linguistics and popular culture as Dungeons & Dragons evolves into a more popular game. And I'm using Dungeons & Dragons as an example because this is particularly where we get that X level class to level X class transition. I think it's really important for us to note that saying, hey, I'm a level 9 wizard, as opposed to saying my 9th level spell or my 9th level caster, one of those feels a little bit easier to say, even though I think my 9th level spell or my 9th level ritual is cooler. I think my level 9 wizard is probably a little bit easier to say. And one thing we know about linguistics is that when there are opportunities to shorten things, or at the very least opportunities to develop slang that is useful and helpful on a broad scale, usually that will supplant whatever came before it. I, again, cannot say this with certainty, as I'm not either a trained linguist nor have I researched this particular topic too deeply, but this seems to me to be fairly obvious in terms of just one of them is easier to say, and as, D&D became more popular, as role-playing games entered into the modern zeitgeist, it just makes sense that we sort of wiped away one pronunciation in favor of another one. But now that we have talked about these things, I am ready for us to talk about curses and residual magic. This, to me, is the most common, other than folk charms, the most common form of folk magic in general. It seems like folk magic usually falls into one of two camps. Either I want protection, help, and blessings in my own life, or I want to take care of the sons of bitches that wronged me. And so curses and residual magic are huge, and one of the ones that I want to talk about immediately are book curses. These would have been placed in the beginning of medieval manuscripts in order to protect them from theft, destruction, or those that would seek to ruin the reputation of the scribes that actually made them. And these carry all kinds of horrible, horrific things. May the person who steals this book have their entrails devoured by Satan as he drags them to hell, for example. It's a common book curse, because you have to realize books were incredibly expensive, difficult, and time-consuming to make, very hard to store properly without damaging them, and represented not just a massive investiture of both time, energy, and talent, but also money. And so, of course, the people who were invested in them, usually monks and educated Catholic clergy who made these books, would actually want to protect them. So again, I mentioned this in our low fantasy video initially, but despite the fact that this goes against the teachings of the church, is definitely heretical, probably would have been punishable in some very serious and severe ways, it still happens, and we have enough examples of book curses that survive that I can take pictures of these and I can put them into a presentation about role-playing games, which I think is really interesting. Other curses exist too. I mentioned that video by Horses and the coexistence of Catholicism and witches in medieval Iceland, but again, one of the things that comes up often are livestock curses. May your cow die, may your crops wither. Those kinds of things would have been common. But now that we have talked about the historical perspective about these things, I am so excited to talk about magic in games, because I think I really cooked with some of these ideas. The first one I want to talk about is not a witchual. No, it's book curses, or aka very Madlibs, because here's the thing. As somebody who really loved Madlibs as a kid, I particularly loved that most book curses seem to follow this formula, and so I have created a very simple table. So you can use this as an example book curse, or you can generate your own, but if I'm GMing, again, you know I hate high prep, I want this to be very simple. I'm just going to use this template, and I will roll. So I have done this very well. So table 1 tells us who is going to be doing the bad thing. May the one who blanks this book be blanked. So, what did they do to the book? What is going to be done to them? Who is going to do it? And in what fashion? And so these are the tables. I'm just going to take a brief second. You may pause, screenshot, do whatever you need to. Again, these rules are here for you to use free of charge. Please use them. It would make me happy to know that you use my Witchuals and my maddest of Madlibs in order to make your games more interesting. But I wanted to show you just a little example. And so I rolled a 2, a 4, a 6, and a 6, which would be, may the one who devours this book be bamboozled by the devil himself in grandiose fashion. Now, there are 2 ways I think you can play this. The first one is kind of a boring way. I think you could have this be a standard sanity drain as the character's mind is overwhelmed by fear of the curse. You could have them see shadows of the devil, or whatever monster, or insert horrible, horrific thing that is going to stalk them to the end of their days because they, licked the wrong book in a monastery. You could do that, and I think that's reasonable and interesting. However, I think the best way to do this is to make it its own adventure. I think you should make each element of the book curse come true gradually until the player is either able to reverse it, or if every instance of the book curse becomes true. If the players take too long, they insta-unalive. I think that is the coolest way to do this. And yes, of course, I put the two most horrific things in the world, the devil who went down to Georgia and Nickelback. Now, let's talk about charms. In the low fantasy video that I did, one of my absolute favorite things was coming up with all of the different bespoke uses for charms, and in fact many of the comments in that video were so supportive I thought maybe we would run it back. And so as a reminder, the majority of your folk magic charms and games should be junk and should have only very specific circumstances where they can be used. This is done to A, allow for creative problem solving, and B, to replicate the experience of being someone who is sifting through 215 junk trinkets looking for the one needle in a haystack that actually has some degree of magical power, and going just a little bit mad trying to figure out exactly what it does. And so I am going to rapid fire some charm abilities. 1, bread you prepare rises twice as fast. 2, you can rust or unrust 2 inches of metal once per day. I think this one would actually be amazing. I think the uses for this would be so cool. If you had an understanding of engineering and architecture, you could rust certain very key elements of a siege engine, a jail cell, a building. I think it'd be kind of cool. Small rodents will bring you items that they can carry, 1d3 items once per week. If you focus for 1 hour, you can turn a piece of tree bark into a dagger. That's kind of metal. It's literally metal. You cannot be tripped by tree roots. Could be cool if you're playing as a yeoman-esque character. Maybe you want to lure people into groves full of, twisting tree roots everywhere so that you have the advantage. Ice in a 20-foot radius melts slowly around you. This has 2 uses. Either 1, you're using it to melt ice, or 2, somebody is using fire magic and you're using this to stop the fire magic from melting the ice quickly. I think because of the way this is worded, and I worded it vaguely on purpose, you could do either. You could turn spoiled meat into stone by going near it and focusing on it or the image of it in your mind. An owl will appear and warn you of danger. You're able to understand how any garment is sewn together. You can stop rowboats from being sunk, and just a bunch of other ones. I realized I wasn't going to read all of these out, but I love this one so much. I think it's really cool. I'm just gonna, screw it. I'm gonna read the other ones too. Whenever you rest in hay for at least 8 hours, you gain the ability to see in the dark for 12. And not my personal favorite, but one of my personal favorites, when 1 or more china plates are present, you can discern when non-magical entities are telling the truth. This one is brought to you by my desire to have a scene where you interrogate somebody in front of Grandma's fine china that she insists only on having out for special guests, and then you find out that Grandma has this trinket, has been well aware of the trinket's abilities, and the special guests are only the people that your grandma wants to interrogate to make sure that you're telling the truth, which makes sense that she only ever brings it out when you bring your significant other over for the first time, because she just wants to make sure that they're good enough for her grandson. But as much fun as these folk charms are, I do want to talk about our Witchuals, and the way that I have set this up is pretty simple. I am going to roll a simple d6 dice. It is going to determine the duration of time the Witchual will take to complete, its impact on the world upon its completion, and the consequences for when it is interrupted. Remember, ritual magic is time-consuming and incredibly dangerous, and as such, I really want to make this less of a hard and fast game rule and more of a, not world building, but more of a way for you to sort of role play and determine what kinds of other rules you would like to implement. Let me go over these and give you some examples. On a 1 to a 2, it's a short ritual with moderate impact and low consequences when interrupted. A ritual of this kind might render a marsh that, just spontaneously starts to flow into an oncoming graveyard. A ritual of moderate power, which takes 3 to 5 weeks and has a major impact, might actually choose to, turn the populace of a small village inside out, and that's going to carry with it the types of consequences you imagine it would, and upon its interruption, those attempting to complete the ritual are the ones that suffer its effects. And a 5 to a 6 means that this is a cataclysmic, at least a 2-year completion time with critical impact and terrifying consequences for its practitioners. A ritual of this kind could turn the moon, for example, into a super weapon that scorches the earth and burns away all life in a single country or kingdom, and if interrupted, the players and those attempting to do the ritual could be exposed to the power of essentially a small sun and what that's going to do to them. Again, I think this is the best way to make a ritual. They're supposed to feel time-consuming, resource-intensive, and dangerous, and I think this is my favorite way of doing it that is incredibly low prep. And with that, my friends, I am going to leave you with a couple things. If you would like to do the pleasantries, these videos do take quite a bit of time for me to make, edit, record, and script out. I would really, really appreciate the pleasantries. I would also appreciate it if you would back the Kickstarter, or if you could recommend it to some of your friends who like indie role-playing games. Again, you can take a picture of the QR code, or go to the description below to get the link to the Kickstarter. I am going to do a formal Q&A section following this one. I did like interspersing them through when I thought it was appropriate and useful, but hopefully you guys do too. I would love to hear in the comments what you think of the new formula and the interspersing both of the Q&A and some of the game design elements. I'd like to get into some more game-centric content in addition to the historical stuff that we've been doing. But until next time, I am Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. I'll see you for the Q&A. You've been awesome. I'll catch you next time. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. We did it. It's time. Thank you all so much for sticking with me. Again, sidebar for those of you who are joining us for a Q&A section for the first time. These are unscripted, unedited. I am usually just reading off of the Discord and the community tabs. Again, if you want to leave questions there for next time, be greatly appreciated. Let's get into it. Seth Mokami said, I'm curious what roughly translates to peasant/folk magic. To use D&D as an example, the categories for me would be arcane, wizards and sorcerers, divine, clerics and paladins, and primal, druids and rangers. Hopefully something along these lines get answered. I do think that we actually did answer this one, and my thought process is it's a combination thereof. If we're going to use D&D's parlance, I would say that it is essentially a combination of divine and arcane magic, of the foul and the divine in those terms of practices. Again, I think one of the things to think about and consider, and I almost made this its own slide, is that human beings are incredibly pragmatic and they're going to do whatever works for them. If their quality of life starts to dip, they will look elsewhere for stuff. I'm sure that's not going to bite anyone politically at all. Like, seriously, I mean, it just bears out all the time. If your kids are starving, if you're having difficulty, and the church isn't cutting it, you'll turn to, any form of power in order to get what you need. And so I think medieval peasants, and I just think just people in general, will turn to whatever is readily apparent. And in that case, it's the combination of the divine and the demonic, or the arcane, I guess, however you want to phrase that. Did you think primal magic would be its own category? I didn't want to go over the druids, and I guess my thought process with that is when I think of folk magic, I think more of the arcane, but I guess the druids are kind of a combination of arcane and religious practices anyway. So, I think that's my thing. It's a combination. Long answer to a short question. Ignacio, my boy, do you think folk magic is a good way to incorporate soft magic into the storyline of a TTRPG? Yes, 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 1,000 times. Yes. And in fact, it's my favorite way to do it. Because it's one of the best ways to make magic feel like real magic. One of the things that I think Dungeons & Dragons gets wrong, that I think things like Dungeon Crawl Classics gets right, is magic is supposed to feel like wibbly wobbly. And I understand that there's a sort of gamification that some people want in this, where they want to understand the impact of every spell. But I like not knowing what magic is going to do. And folk magic, with its sort of fuzzy boundaries and unclear ramifications and parameters, I think offers a really great way to introduce soft magic into a campaign. And it's something that I've fallen in love with. I put it in pretty much all of my campaigns if I'm going to run a traditional low fantasy setting, or even a traditional fantasy setting in general. I might make a video about how I approach high magic and high fantasy at some point, but I really love this, and I love talking about folk magic. So, Noetic Fox, basically, I had to sum up this question because it was a lot of paragraphs, wants to know how something goes from the mundane to the magical, and I think that's an interesting question, and one that we are still sort of studying and trying to, wind up working on some other stuff. Essentially, I think when things go from the mundane to the magical are when we start to ascribe power to them, right? It's like, when does somebody like George Washington, to use American history for example, go from just a random senator in Virginia to this sort of mythical deified figure? And it's essentially over hundreds of years of practice and culture and time. That's a really big thing and a really big deal. One of the other things too is that over time, if a human being starts to observe phenomena that they cannot explain or understand, I think that will also develop into magic. This is the case with the cauldrons that I mentioned earlier and how they would have been used in brewing, but I think it's also true for something that we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is like precious metals, essentially. Philip Mead asked, what makes folk magic, specifically folk, is it unsuitable for other purposes in some way? Yes, I think it is unsuitable for some purposes in some way. I think if you want to, shoot a lightning bolt at someone's face in the middle of an encounter, you're not gonna turn to folk magic because it's gonna take too much time. Your charms are gonna be more related to things in your everyday life. The passive magic is going to be more related to things in everyday life than it is going to be doing that. If you want flashy, dramatic, and immediate, I think folk magic is not going to be something that is going to be useful. But I think if you want to do something with a little bit more prep, it definitely is. When we run a game, what might separate it from adventure-oriented magic? Oh man, I cannot wait to be over this cough. And I think I talked about that, but it's the immediacy, it's the time, and I think it's connection to the world of games in general. There's something bucolic and down to earth, and that's sort of like wrapped in the sinews of storytelling. When we're talking about a peasant's charm, which is this smooth stone that's been carved, and the initials of every man that's ever carried it has been carved into its surface, and it's been passed down from farmhand to farmhand over a series of years. That to me feels more meaningful as a storytelling component, as a storytelling thing, than something along the lines of, I don't know, just some rando just showing up and crushing things in a lightning bolt tower or something along those lines. I know that probably is a terrible example, and I'm purposely strawmanning it, but to me that's what feels oomph. It has meaning. It has reason. I don't know. I like those particular things. All right, passing over to the Discord. We talked Carl's questions about that. Carl asked, was it more proto-science side of things, or was it akin to faith? About how widespread magic was. And my response, Carl, is both. I think it's both and a mixture, right? Proto-science, yeah, chemistry absolutely played a role in magic, or early chemistry did play a role in magic, right? Alchemists were, in some cases, massive charlatans, and in some cases, people who were fumbling around with early science. And then, of course, you had real scientists who essentially were making magic. I forget who said it, but there's a science fiction fantasy writer who said that any amount of science and math that is not understandable is basically wizardry and sorcery anyway, which I think is really, really important. Chris Bates, what types of magic are folk magic? I think all of them. Anything that somebody would have used to gain a edge might have mattered. I think there's, of course, some elements of heresy to that. Like, is this something that is accepted by the established religion, faith, and culture? Is this something that never reached a religion in its own right, or that is from old religions no longer practiced or has died away? Yes, it can be from something that has never reached a religion in its own right. It could also be from old religions that have died away, or it could, of course, be co-opted from existing religions. Hedge magic and paganism are real-life examples. Druidic magic was often separated in popular belief from black magic, seen more like herbalism. Is this an important distinction? Yes. And I will tell you, I think, what the distinction is. I cannot say this as historical fact, but my guess would be how useful is an herbalist versus how useful is a demonologist. The herbalist might be able to make stuff that helps your head stop hurting, or helps your wife deliver her baby and live to tell the tale, which infant mortality in the Middle Ages was bad. I mean, infant mortality now is bad, at least here in the US. It's not great, depending on where you live. Woo, access to reproductive science. But again, that is useful. An herbalist helps keep you all alive. A demonologist, it might just be a weird dude with some musty tomes. I think that actually that pragmatism does have some translation, some importance when we're talking about that. If nobody falls foul of magic, is it seen as science advancement or just heresy waiting to be uncovered? And again, I think this falls to the use of and the importance of the community itself. Ooh, what the heck just happened? Okay, well, apparently my whole shtick just came down. Alright, well, let's keep going. If a witch turned themselves into a salamander, would burning at the stake really work? If this is a real salamander, probably, right? Those aren't fire resistant. If it is the alchemical spirit of salamander, probably not. And finally, in the Fables comics by Bill Willingham and published by DC Vertigo, why is Frau Totenkaiser the best name for any witch ever? for so many reasons. And of course you love fables, Chris, because you're just a based human being in general. One, because Totenkinder means like Kinder is kid. And so there's that like Germanic, like, oh, she's related to the kids, which is there. But also I think the thing for me about Frau Totenkinder and fables in general is the Grimm fairy tales were so foundational for my love of a lot of things, and were such a great take on urban fantasy and a retranslation and recontextualization of fairy tales that it just, everything about fairy tales just rules. It's just great. Absolutely great. Zoe asked, what were the root of the myths around different metals? Silver for werewolves, iron for fae, etc. And Fluffy, of course, asked what myths exist around different metals. These, I think, come from one very simple thing, and this is more a question of anthropology than it is, anthropology and history, and of course, English. Everything's all connected. It's why I think you should study as much as you can about everything. But one of the things that I want to talk about with this particular one is that, again, human beings will make up correlations and causations when they cannot explain away natural phenomena. And one of the things that comes up pretty often is the use of these precious metals. You see, like, these precious metals have things that are ascribed to them, and scientific properties that are ascribed to them, and I think that's going to be what it really does, like what it does and what is useful about it, right? Gold having antimicrobial properties, not rusting and being used for dental implants now, but again, gold having antimicrobial properties in addition to being hard to find makes it easier for somebody to ascribe magical power to it. Silver, again, antimicrobial properties, being hard to find, difficult to get access to, makes it more likely to do this. One of the biggest examples of this is not iron, but steel. So when I read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Icelandic sagas, one of the things that comes up is that many Englishmen, when they fought, or Saxons, whatever you want to call them, when they fought the Viking raiders, thought the swords were cursed, because what would happen was the sword would get caught in a Saxon shield and it wouldn't break. It would wobble, and then it would. The legends basically make it out like it like whipped around like a snake and then reformed into steel. We know this to be a natural process because the Vikings at this time weren't using iron or swords or like any of that stuff. They were using crucible steel because they were able to gain access to Iranian forges and the superior crucible steel of Iranian forge masters and blacksmiths by trade routes that they had going into certain caliphates. So again, this is an example of us ascribing metal with a certain property because we just don't know and can't understand its its properties, its use, the way that it would work. So woo. Carl asked again, was magic typically thought of as a curse? Yes, of course, absolutely. I say the words, the magic things happen, or was it a negotiation? Also this too, again, I think it's just whatever works and whatever we think works is what magic was to a lot of these people, right? Yes, it could be curses like the book curses, or you could curse someone's field, their flocks, their wife, whatever. You could also try to bargain, right? The myth of Faust, but demonic bargains in general do come up both in Catholic faith and Catholic literature, Catholic myth, and even in European folklore that is not religiously related. But of course, it could be something as simple as, useful things, useful charms, whatever, and what have you. I think, what else is there? I think there's only like one or two more. Twin Steel asked if he was once told that Tolkien had a big impact on the idea of iron affecting fairies, and he was perhaps a progenitor of the idea that cold iron hurts the fae. I don't think that was truly him. My guess would be that it's something that maybe he helped to propagate an understanding of. I think one of the things that we take for granted is like Tolkien and Lewis were both medievalists in their own right, and did contribute to the scholarship of medieval history, which is really cool. I actually had somebody be like, you should, when I did the Knight video, was like, you need to read, I can't remember if it was Lewis or Tolkien and their conversation on Knights. And so like some of their scholarship is really good. The scholarship on Knights is hopelessly naive, I think, and very idealistic. And I say that as somebody who is an idealist, and is probably hopefully naive as well. But even I have to recognize sometimes that there's some implicit bias in things. Tolkien especially is very much like beats the drum for England, in maybe some not so great ways. Again, I think Tolkien's a great guy. I don't want to besmirch him. One of the, it seemed from most of the stuff that I have read that the dude genuinely did walk the walk and talk the talk to go along with it. So, but again, it's hard for us to separate that. My guess would be that they helped Jethro stop dropping things. My guess would be that Tolkien helped to propagate those myths because Tolkien was very big into the preservation of British and Saxon folktales in general. That would be my guess. And Salty Nick asked what Disney princess would be most active on Instagram and why, which is crazy work. Man, what a good question to end it on. I'm gonna say, I want to say it's like, and you could say it's gonna be somebody superficial. I think it would be Ariel, because I think if anything I have learned from the Disney's Little Mermaid is she has like all of that stuff in that cave. She sings a whole song about it. I have no doubt she would be somebody who would like hoard memes and like liked videos and like funny stuff that she wanted to send and like links to people on like her Instagram page. I'll be honest, actually, I think Ariel would be a Tumblr user for sure, and I think her Tumblr page would be literally like a cave of wonders. Like Jasmine thinks she's seen the Cave of Wonders. Ariel's Tumblr page would be a literal cave of wonders. Absolutely insane and crazy. I love it, and I think it's super cool. So I think that's going to be where I leave it for today. Thank you again to everybody that watched the video, supported it. Again, give our pal Smoke Cellar a shout out as well. He did some of the art for this video, which was super cool. The art in the beginning of that awesome peasant shooting the lightning bolt, which is amazing. Really love it. Huge shout out to Smoke Cellar for that. Thank you, Smoke Cellar. It was super cool just to have you do that, and I loved his use of the pitchfork as a wizard staff. I thought was super cool as well. So in any case, guys, thank you so much. Help support the Kickstarter if you can. Just keep being good people. I really appreciate you for sticking around. Jethro, say goodbye. Goodbye, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Jethro. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You guys are amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.